Knowledge Products presents The World of Philosophy. Confucius, Lao Tzu, and the Chinese Philosophy. Narrated by Lynn Redgrave. Part 1.
Many people throughout the world are familiar with the ancient Chinese symbol called the yin-yang. It's a circular figure with black and white swirls that symbolize the interdependence of opposites. The figure shows that opposites, such as female and male or good and evil, depend on each other. The same is true of other opposing pairs, such as earth and heaven, power and receptivity, or tradition and innovation. China's intellectual tradition itself displays this swirling interplay of opposites. It is a story of some 25 centuries, featuring some of the most stodgy traditionalists and some of the most brilliant innovators that the world has ever seen. Chinese philosophy is a tradition of profound insights and colorful characters as well. For example, the Taoist sage Tzu was something of a wild man. According to the philosopher Chuang, Tzu engaged in great flights of intellect and in great flights of the body.
Tzu could ride the wind and go soaring around with cool and breezy skill.
Such bodily flight certainly must have impressed Tzu's disciples. China's great sage, Confucius, however, would not have flown even if he could. He would have regarded it as improper. It was said that Confucius refused even to sit down unless his mat was turned precisely in the correct direction as specified by tradition. So as we journey into Chinese philosophy, we will ride the pendulum between reverence and blasphemy, conservatism and radicalism, and perhaps even sanity and insanity. Chinese philosophy is one of the oldest and deepest traditions of human thought. Its golden age lasted roughly from the birth of Confucius in 551 BC until China was unified and learning was suppressed in 221 BC. This period is comparable both in time span and in importance to the golden era of Greek philosophy, which occurred at about the same time. Many schools of philosophy flourished during China's golden era. The ideas developed during that time have shaped not only the course of Chinese history, but more recently they have shaped world thought as well. The great philosophers of China's golden era, such as Confucius, Tzu, Lao Tzu, and Chuang were profound thinkers. Chuang was also a hilarious wit, as were some others to a lesser degree. Each of these thinkers dealt with the deepest and most immediate questions of human life. How should people live? How should rulers govern? And what is the nature of human spiritual life? As Westerners, we can learn much from this tradition that is at once so similar and yet so alien to our own. A good starting point for our discussion is generally to compare the intellectual traditions of China and the West. First of all, China's various traditions show fewer radical changes and more continuity than the Western traditions. Though there were intermittent bursts of radical creativity in Taoism and Chan Buddhism, even these were soon codified into consistent traditions that unfolded over centuries. Confucianism became the official philosophy of China's rulers during the time of the Han Dynasty, which was about the same time that Jesus lived in the Middle East. Despite a few periods of upheaval, Confucianism has remained the fundamental philosophy of China for 2,000 years. Confucianism has changed dramatically over the ages, yet Chinese thinkers have continually referred back to the classic Confucian texts. They have often cited or credited Confucius himself as the authority for their own developments of the tradition. This is partially due to the special character of Confucianism, which emphasizes respect for elders, obedience to authority, and the importance of ceremony in shaping a culture. Confucius actually wrote during the Zhou dynasty, which followed the Xia and Yin dynasties as the third dynasty of China, and Confucius commented on the traditions of his time.
The Yin built on the rites of the Xia. What was added and what was omitted can be known. The Zhou built on the rites of the Yin. What was added and what was omitted can be known. Should there be a successor to the Zhou, even 100 generations hence, can be known.
Confucius recognized that things change, but he also thought that rites and traditions should be preserved. Indeed, 100 generations after Confucius, the Chinese still were performing many of the rites that Confucius described in his teachings. The Confucian emphasis on tradition may be partly explained by the character of the Chinese culture that preceded Confucius. Chinese folk religion had emphasized ancestor worship, and China's ruling hierarchy had been invested with great power and authority. Taoism, China's other great school of thought, began in large measure by setting itself against Confucianism, but even in opposition, its development was slow and relatively consistent through the ages. The Taoists also respected tradition. They recognized Confucius as a sage, and they quoted his teachings. By contrast, philosophical movements in the Western tradition have often opposed one another. The great French philosopher René Descartes, for example, began several of his books by saying that he intended to throw tradition into doubt and to ignore all previous thought. It is questionable whether Descartes succeeded in doing so, but for our purposes it's important to note that few Chinese philosophers, except perhaps the Chan masters, ever tried to abandon their heritage. The Chinese tradition also contrasts with the West in that it is consistently syncretic, which means that it combines philosophical standpoints that may seem as wildly opposed as black and white. Opposite standpoints are thus combined into a single view, much as opposites are conjoined in the yin-yang figure. To many Western philosophers, this makes Chinese philosophy seem inconsistent. But for the Chinese, syncretism has been an important way to institute changes without disturbing the content of the tradition. For example, as Confucianism became China's orthodox philosophy, and sometimes even its religion, it absorbed many elements of Taoism and Buddhism. Confucianism combined these views into one tradition. By contrast, philosophical schools in the Western tradition have more frequently purified themselves of outside influences in order to deliver a single view. The Chinese tradition is also frequently less abstract and less general than its Western counterpart. The great Taoist sage Lao Tzu wondered how to lead a life in harmony with nature. Confucius started with very practical questions of how states should be governed, and his philosophy requires its adherents to be curious about such things as duty and proper behavior. According to Confucius,
there is nothing I can do with a man who is not constantly saying, "What am I to do? What am I to do?"
Like most ancient Chinese philosophers, Confucius was not concerned with people's general beliefs, but rather with their day-to-day behavior. Neither Confucius nor Lao Tzu asked the very general questions that characterize Western philosophy, such as, what is the nature of knowledge, and does God exist? For the most part, Chinese thinkers are also far less systematic than Western ones. Philosophers like Aristotle or Immanuel Kant produced comprehensive systems of integrated thought. Confucius and Lao Tzu produced cryptic sayings that are open to a wide variety of interpretations. This elusive quality has led some Western thinkers to doubt that Confucius and Lao Tzu were philosophers at all. Finally, Chinese philosophy is more closely identified with religion than Western philosophy is. Although Christian theologians such as St. Thomas Aquinas were also great philosophers, Confucius and Lao Tzu themselves founded major religions in addition to schools of philosophy. Later Chinese thought became very closely aligned with Buddhism. But whether Confucius and Lao Tzu are regarded as primarily philosophical or religious figures, it's clear that the great Chinese sages have much to say that is philosophically interesting in its own right. And perhaps the best response to criticism of the Chinese tradition is to remember that while there are important differences between the East and West, there are many common philosophical concerns that transcend cultural differences, and there is much to be gained from seeing familiar problems in a new way. Confucius was one of the greatest philosophers of the golden age of Chinese philosophy. In many ways, he has been the dominant figure of China's entire history of thought and culture. In fact, Confucius was the first historical figure in China to have a body of thought attached to his name. When Confucius was born in 551 BC, Chinese civilization already was ancient. Historical records of the first two Chinese dynasties are unreliable, but it's estimated that China had existed as an organized empire for some 1,500 years before Confucius was born. China had traditionally been ruled by an emperor who was known as the Son of Heaven. The empire was organized into smaller states, each ruled by a lord or prince. The economy was feudal, with all land owned by the emperor and directly controlled by the local feudal lord. The vast majority of Chinese were peasants who farmed land that was held by others. Confucius is said to have descended from a noble family in the small state of Lu in modern Shandong. This is located in the central section of China's coastal area to the east, just across the Yellow Sea from what is now Korea. Confucius served as an advisor to various lords, and at one point as a police commissioner, and these experiences helped to explain his philosophy. He was concerned above all with the proper administration of the state. The two central concepts of Confucian thought are li, which means rites or ceremonies, and jian, which has been translated as humaneness. For Confucius, the li, or rites, are the fundamental principle of political and social organization. They embody the culture's heritage in such things as mourning for the dead and worshipping the spirits. Rites had long defined the Chinese order and tradition out of which Confucius emerged, and he was charged with preserving and enforcing that tradition when he became an official. Confucius, then, was a conservative in the sense that he continually turned to tradition for guidance. The basic text of Confucianism, entitled Analects, is a collection of Confucian sayings assembled by his followers. In it, Confucius is said to observe,
"One does not explain away what is already done. One does not argue against what is already accomplished. And one does not condemn what has already gone by."
Confucius obviously did not regard his own teachings as revolutionary. He saw them as a way of preserving what had gone before.
"I transmit but do not innovate. I am truthful in what I say and devoted to antiquity."
Traditional Chinese culture was heavily ceremonial. Elaborate mourning and funeral rites were practiced, and the traditional folk religion emphasized the veneration and worship of ancestors. The Chinese also tried to predict the future by various means of divination, such as reading leaves or cracking tortoise shells, and then interpreting them according to the figures given in the famous I Ching. Various spiritual beings were worshipped, including Shangdi, the supreme emperor of heaven. Heaven, or the sky itself, Tian, was widely worshipped as a deity. Yet Confucius was much more concerned with how people behave than with what they believe. He went into great detail about how rites should be performed, yet he said almost nothing about gods or spirits. According to the Analects,
the topics the master did not speak of were prodigies, force, disorder, and gods.
Confucius had little interest in the vast and abstract questions that consumed philosophers and theologians in the West, such as the nature of God. Instead, Confucius wanted to describe the proper way to worship. He sought to explain how people could fill their daily lives with a spiritual and socially significant content by participating in the li, or rites. According to the Analects, Confucius carefully observed the proprieties of dress and deportment.
On going through the outer gates to the Lord's court, he drew himself in, as though the entrance was too small to admit him. When he went past the station of his Lord, his face took on a serious expression. His step became brisk, and his words seemed more laconic. When he lifted the hem of his robe to ascend the hall, He drew himself in, stopped inhaling, as if he had no need to breathe.
The Analects abound with descriptions of Confucius's proper habits and demeanor. When Confucian teachings became the orthodox philosophy of China, an already rigid culture became even more rigid in its pursuit of proper behavior. But we might ask, why did Confucius place such tremendous emphasis on proper ceremony? First of all, the Zhou dynasty was disintegrating, and China's emperor had become a mere figurehead. Actual authority was held by feudal lords. The empire was descending into a period known as the Warring States, an era when small states struggled to control China. Confucius was therefore writing in a time of great political and social upheaval. By turning back to tradition, he hoped to re-establish a firm basis for an ordered social life. He believed that proper rites could provide a coordinating medium for state power. But there are also deep philosophical reasons for the Confucian emphasis on li. According to Confucius, we human beings are, above all, social creatures. To be a social being is to be bound up in a system of rites and traditions that locate or establish the individual's place in society. Li, therefore, defines people's social lives and even provides them with an identity. In participating sincerely and correctly in a ceremony, people fully experience such emotions as grief at a funeral, joy at a wedding, or veneration in a ritual honoring a parent or a lord. Confucius explained how li defines the individual.
Unless a man has the spirit of the rites, in being respectful, he will wear himself out. In being careful, he will become timid. In having courage, he will become unruly. And in being forthright, he will become intolerant.
Confucius believed that if respect, care, and courage are channeled through the proper social forms, they become full-fledged virtues. Rights also make it possible for a state to govern without brutality. In many cases, Confucius advises rulers not to impose their laws by force. He said they simply should set an example by observing the proper li. The disciple Zhengzi gave this advice, probably to a ruler who was experiencing political difficulties.
Conduct the funeral of your parents with meticulous care, and let not the sacrifices to your remote ancestors be forgotten, and the virtue of the common people will incline towards fullness.
Confucius advises political leaders to sincerely participate in meaningful ceremony so that their subjects will do the same.
Guide them by edicts. Keep them in line with punishments, and the common people will stay out of trouble, but will have no sense of shame. Guide them by virtue. Keep them in line with the rights, and they will, besides having a sense of shame, reform themselves.
If each person performs the proper rites, then each person will play the proper social role, and the people will govern themselves. The Analects recount this tale.
Duke Qing of Qi asked Confucius about government. Confucius answered,
Let the ruler be a ruler, the subject a subject, the father a father, the son a son.
To be a ruler or a son is to sincerely accomplish the li appropriate to that role. Therefore, social cohesion, whether in a family or in a state, can be accomplished only through sincerely practiced ceremony. At times, li seems to encompass all social practices and conventions. Above all, it includes language, which is essentially an elaborate structure of social conventions that allow people to express themselves and communicate with one another. Therefore, one of the central concepts in Confucian philosophy is a doctrine known as the rectification of names. The Analects explains the importance of this concept.
Zhu Lu said,
If the Lord of Wei left the administration of his state to you, what would you put first?
The master said,
If something has to be put first, It is perhaps the rectification of names.
Applying the correct names in a consistent manner is the key to an orderly culture based on Li, and Confucius insists that people need to adopt a common language for thinking and communicating. This will create a cohesive culture that gives meaning not only to words, but also to people's lives. Finally, Li holds out the possibility that culture may become a work of art that the people can create together. When an elaborate ceremony is done properly and lovingly, it becomes a thing of beauty and an occasion for joy. Confucius was a musician, and he saw strong similarities between a good society and a musical work.
This much can be known about music. It begins with playing in unison. When it gets into full swing, it is harmonious, clear, and unbroken. In this way, it reaches its conclusion.
For Confucius, the ideal state is a harmonious performance of many parts, just like a band or an orchestra that plays well together. When people have an authentic body of Li, no one must be forced to behave properly. They simply, freely, and spontaneously do what is right. And when this happens, a state or society is not only orderly, it is also beautiful.
This is the end of Part 1. Please download Part 2 to continue.